Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tech Chat. Now today I'm being joined by Alan Grau, who's the VP of IoT Embedded Solutions at Sectigo. So Alan, thank you very much for coming on this episode and taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to our conversation today because we're going to be looking at the history of IoT attacks over the years and how understanding of the past can help organizations understand the evolution of hackers' abilities. To start off with, I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of the key overviews of the different eras of IoT attacks and really how it's been evolving.
Yeah, so, we put together the infographic that you're referring to. And in that, we talked about three different eras. We started out with what we called the age of exploration. From there, moved into the age of exploitation. And then, much more recently, moving into what we're calling the age of protection. And as you look at this, really many early devices, even before people started to talk about the IoT, for a long time, we've had connected embedded devices. Some of those devices were built, in an era where there really wasn't much thought given to security. These devices were built in many cases before pervasive security threats were a major concern. And they were built as specialized systems that would live on isolated networks, and they might talk to a small number of other devices, but they were never intended to be connected to a network that allowed someone in halfway across the world to start sending packets to that device. The assumption is these are specialized devices. They're going to live in my little local network in my factory, and 20 or 30 other devices will ever talk to them. And so there just wasn't a lot of consideration given to building security into the devices early on. Obviously, as time passed, everything became connected, and suddenly we've got devices that are controlling critical infrastructure that are accessible across the public internet. And so, early on, there were some early attacks where, some of the attacks were just typical IT attacks that happened to stumble across IoT devices, right? Somebody had built an automated attack that went out and scanned a range of IP addresses, started trying to probe things, and in doing so, some of these early unprotected devices kind of fell victim to some of those attacks. Some of the other things that we saw early on were some very specific targeted attacks at particular devices. So it's kind of a dichotomy early on, but in most cases, the devices just, again, weren't built with much security into them, other than, a lot of times the expectation was an isolated network. And then as time evolved, people started to build more, started to air gap their networks. So they were intentionally expecting that separation. But again, if malware got on the network in an air gapped situation, everything behind that air gap was suddenly, very vulnerable. So that was, really some of the very early history. Then we moved into what we called the age of exploration, which, two things started to happen here. One is companies started to pay a little bit more attention to security and building security into IoT devices, but it was a pretty slow process. But the other big part of what we have seen is groups and individuals starting to more directly attack IoT devices, starting to build specific attacks that did target, specific IoT devices. There were a number of attacks against not autonomous vehicles, but connected vehicles that were, again, very specifically engineered against those devices. A lot of what I saw is, people being slow to react. There wasn't a strong need or urgency, rather, to build security into devices. And I had many conversations with people building devices, and a lot of it boiled down to what's the ROI for building security into my device. And they, as the equipment manufacturers, didn't see it putting dollars in their top line or their bottom line. So they largely deferred building in strong security, but started to build in a few elements because it was starting to recognize the need for greater security. And then now, as we're entering what I'm calling the age of protection, I'm using that terminology because companies are now starting to really recognize that security has to be a priority. It can't be an afterthought. And that's occurred partially because of just the number of high-profile attacks against IoT devices that we've seen. right? So many devices have been attacked that people can no longer ignore the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of the narrative that I've been kind of having around IoT over the past couple of years, is that not laxed attitude, but it definitely wasn't at the forefront. And it's nice to see now that people are taking it seriously and are realizing the dangers that come with not properly preparing. And I think we've spoken about the three eras, and at the moment we're kind of in the third one. What are your predictions for kind of the next era of IoT attacks, and how do we make sure they're as secure as possible, really?
Well, I think in terms of predictions, I expect kind of a mixed bag going forward. I do expect that we will still see attacks. We will still see successful attacks because, well, first off, there are many devices already deployed that don't have adequate security, and they will continue to remain vulnerable. And there are still people building devices that aren't being proactive about building the levels of security in that are required. But I do expect to see, many devices with stronger security being deployed, right? We're working with a number of companies that are being very proactive about building security into their solutions. And one of the things that companies need to do, is they need to start focusing on security very early in the design process. You need to be selecting a hardware platform that has some security capabilities built into the hardware. You need to have, the hooks to be able to implement a strong secure boot solution. You need to have a mechanism to protect private keys on the device using a hardware secure element, a TPM chip, some sort of capability built into the device. And then once you've got that, you've got the hardware fundamentals to build a strong security solution on top of that. So you can then layer on, secure boot, strong authentication, PKI and certificates for strong identity solutions. And as we do that, I think we will start to see devices that are much more difficult for hackers to be able to attack and find vulnerabilities in the device. I don't expect the problem to completely go away. Hackers are, they're very good at finding vulnerabilities and weaknesses in products. So there will always be, those vulnerabilities that are discovered. But once we've got the fundamental security capabilities in place, it's going to be much more difficult. And some of these broad attacks that like the Mirai botnet that took down large portions of the internet because they had this massive botnet of devices that they were actually fairly easily able to take control of. I hope to see that those types of broad sweeping attacks become a thing of the past.
Yeah, 100% agree. And as you say, it's impossible to defend against everything. People are always going to find a way to get into systems. It's just being prepared, understanding where the issues have come before, and hopefully making it a better place. But Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for coming on, talking us through this, and we'll be interested to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Alan. And thank you, everyone who took the time to watch this episode. We hope you took a lot away from it. For more information, you can head over to sectigo.com. You can also find us on our social channels at EM360 on Twitter and LinkedIn. Subscribe to this YouTube channel for more great content. And as always, for everyday content, you can go to em360tech.com.